Sins of the father. A generational curse is how an Appalachian family was turned into living nightmares. This is not merely a title. It is the horrifying reality of what occurred deep in the mountains of eastern Kentucky, where a family's darkest secrets lay buried for more than 7 decades. The year was 1978. In the remote hollows of Pike County, Kentucky, where steep hillsides cling to coal mining towns and fog blankets the valleys like a shroud, a discovery was made by social worker Margaret Hayes that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She had been sent to investigate reports of neglected children in an area locals called Blackburn Hollow, a place so isolated that even the mail carrier refused to venture there. From the county seat, Margaret's journey to Blackburn Hollow took 3 hours. The last 2 miles were only navigable on foot along a muddy creek bed. Here, the Appalachian wilderness was dense and unforgiving, with towering oaks and hickories blocking out most of the sunlight even at midday. The air carried the scent of damp earth and rotting leaves, and the only sounds were the rushing creek and the occasional cry of a crow. When Margaret finally emerged into a small clearing, she stopped dead in her tracks. What stood before her could barely be called a homestead. It was a collection of ramshackle structures built from scavenged wood and rusted metal sheets. Yet it wasn't the poverty that made her blood run cold. It was the children. 7 of them sat in the dirty yard, their ages ranging from what appeared to be 4 to 16 years old. So profoundly unusual were their physical appearances that Margaret initially thought they might be victims of some terrible accident. The eldest boy had a skull so misshapen his forehead protruded at an unnatural angle, his eyes set too far apart. A young girl, perhaps 10, had a severely clefted palate that twisted her upper lip grotesquely, exposing malformed teeth and gums. Another child's hands were fused together at the fingers, creating paddle-like appendages. But what disturbed Margaret most was their behavior. With vacant expressions, they stared at her, making guttural sounds rather than words. The older boy rocked back and forth rhythmically, seemingly unaware of her presence despite standing only 15 feet away. From the largest structure, an elderly woman emerged, her weathered face bearing the same distinctive characteristics as the children, the wide-set eyes, the prominent brow, the unusual jaw structure. She wore a faded cotton dress that might have been blue once but was now grayed by years of wear and mountain water washing. "State ain't got no business here," the woman said, her voice raspy and defensive. "These are Blackburn children. Blackburn land. We take care of our own." Margaret identified herself and explained she was there to ensure the children's welfare. The woman, who introduced herself as Viola Blackburn, insisted everything was fine, but her agitation was obvious. "Check if you're already subscribed to this channel." She positioned herself between Margaret and the children, her body language both protective and hostile. "How many people live here, Mrs. Blackburn?" Margaret asked, pulling out her notepad with trembling hands. "Enough," Viola replied curtly. "My husband Silas, our boys and their wives, and the young uns. Same as it's been for generations." As they spoke, from the tree line, 2 men appeared carrying rusted buckets. They were brothers, Margaret would later learn, both showing the same physical characteristics as Viola and the children. Their movements were slow and deliberate, their expressions flat. One of them was missing several teeth and both had the same protruding brow ridge that seemed to be a family hallmark. The shorter brother spoke, "Mama, who's this?" His speech was slurred, difficult to understand. "Nobody," Viola snapped. "She's leaving." But Margaret wasn't leaving. Not yet. For 12 years she had been a social worker. She had seen poverty and neglect across eastern Kentucky, but nothing had prepared her for this. These weren't just poor mountain children. These were children bearing the unmistakable physical markers of something far more disturbing. Over the next 3 days, Margaret returned with a county health nurse and a deputy sheriff. What they uncovered was a family tree that twisted back on itself like a serpent eating its own tail. The Blackburn family had lived in this hollow since the 1880s. And according to county records that Margaret painstakingly researched, they had been marrying within their own family for at least 4 generations. The patriarch, Silas Blackburn, was 68 years old in 1978. He was both father and grandfather to many of the children in the hollow. His wife, Viola, was his first cousin. Their sons had married their own cousins, and in at least 2 documented cases, their own sisters. So isolated and intertwined had the family become that determining exact relationships was nearly impossible. The genetic consequences were both devastating and visible. Of the 17 children living in Blackburn Hollow, only 3 showed no obvious physical deformities. The others displayed a horrifying catalogue of genetic disorders, severe intellectual disabilities, cleft palates, skeletal malformations, fused digits, microcephaly, and various facial dysmorphisms that made some children barely recognizable as human. The county health officer who examined the children, Dr. James Morrison, later testified, "In my 30 years of medical practice, I have never seen such a concentration of genetic abnormalities in a single family group. What these children are suffering from is what we call inbreeding depression, the accumulation of harmful recessive genes that only manifest when both parents carry the same defective genetic material. The probability of this occurring naturally in an outbred population is infinitesimally small. This is the direct result of sustained multigenerational consanguineous relationships." The investigation revealed that the Blackburn family's isolation wasn't entirely by choice. Historical records showed that over the decades, the family had been pushed further and further into the mountains, driven by shame and rejection from surrounding communities who were aware of the family's ways. By the 1940s, they had essentially become invisible, existing in a pocket of Appalachia that the modern world had forgotten. Margaret discovered that not a single Blackburn child had ever attended school. None had birth certificates. Several of the adults were unable to read or write. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel. They lived by subsistence farming, hunting, and occasional coal scavenging from abandoned mines. Their contact with the outside world was minimal, perhaps one trip to town every few months for supplies they couldn't produce themselves. The discovery of the Blackburn family would set off a chain of events that would expose not just one family's tragedy but a hidden epidemic of consanguinity in the isolated mountains of Appalachia, where poverty, geography, and generations of silence had created pockets of genetic devastation that the rest of America never knew existed. But the Blackburn story was only beginning to unfold, and the darkest secrets of the sins of the father were still buried deep in that hollow. To understand how the Blackburn family descended into such genetic horror, one must travel back to 1882, when the family's isolation truly began. That was the year Ezekiel Blackburn, a coal miner from Virginia, moved his family deep into the Kentucky mountains after a scandal that had made them pariahs in their previous community. According to court documents uncovered by Margaret Hayes during her investigation, Ezekiel's eldest son, Nathaniel, had been caught in an inappropriate relationship with his younger sister, Ruth, when she became pregnant at age 15 in 1881. Rather than face prosecution and public humiliation, Ezekiel gathered his family, his wife, 6 children, and whatever possessions they could carry, and vanished into the uncharted wilderness of Pike County. They settled in what would become Blackburn Hollow, a valley so remote that it took a 2-day journey from the nearest settlement. Here they built their homestead and resolved to live apart from a society that had condemned them. It was a decision that would echo through 5 generations with increasingly catastrophic consequences. Nathaniel and Ruth's child, born in 1882, was a boy they named Silas, the same Silas who had become the patriarch Margaret encountered in 1978. This first Silas showed no obvious abnormalities, likely because this was the first generation of inbreeding. Genetics is a cruel lottery that often doesn't reveal its full hand until the damage compounds over multiple generations. By the early 1900s, the Blackburn family had grown to 15 members, all living in the hollow. Ezekiel had died in a mining accident in 1895, and his widow Martha had become the family matriarch. Under her watch, the family's isolation deepened. She had seen how the outside world treated them, and she was determined to keep her family together, no matter the cost. The first obvious signs of genetic trouble appeared in 1903 when Nathaniel and Ruth's daughter, Abigail, gave birth to twins. One twin was stillborn, grotesquely malformed with what a traveling doctor later described in his journal as severe cranial abnormalities incompatible with life. The surviving twin, a girl named Esther, appeared normal at birth but developed seizures within her first year and never learned to walk or speak. Yet, even this tragedy didn't break the family's pattern. Isolation and limited partners meant that Blackburn children continued to marry their cousins and occasionally their closer relations. The family had convinced themselves this was God's will, that they were a chosen people set apart from the sinful world below the mountain. By the 1920s, the genetic consequences were becoming impossible to ignore. Medical journals from that era occasionally documented pockets of degeneration in isolated mountain communities, though they rarely named specific families. One 1927 study by a eugenics researcher, Dr. Albert Pritty, included photographs and case studies from eastern Kentucky that almost certainly referred to the Blackburns, though they were identified only as Family B. Dr. Pritty wrote, "Family B presents a textbook case of the dangers of consanguineous marriage. Over 3 generations of first cousin and uncle-niece pairings, we observe increasing rates of infant mortality, physical deformity, and mental deficiency. Of 23 children born to this family group, only 11 survived past age 5, and of those, only 3 possessed normal intellectual capacity." The Great Depression hit Appalachia particularly hard and the Blackburn family's isolation intensified. They had almost no cash income, surviving entirely on what they could grow, hunt, or forage. This economic pressure further limited any chance of family members seeking partners outside the hollow. Who would marry into such poverty? Who would venture into such remote territory? Silas Blackburn, the grandson of the original Silas, was born in 1910 to parents who were first cousins. He grew to adulthood, showing some of the family's characteristic features: the wide-set eyes, the heavy brow ridge, but he retained normal intelligence and could read at a basic level, having been taught by his grandmother, Martha, before her death in 1918. In 1931, at age 21, Silas married his cousin Viola, who was 17. Their union was blessed by the family matriarch, Silas's mother, Esther, the same Esther who had survived when her twin died at birth. Though she had never gained the ability to speak or walk, she communicated through grunts and gestures, confined to a wooden chair that her family moved around the homestead as seasons changed. Silas and Viola's first child arrived in 1932, a boy they named Tobias. He appeared healthy at birth, a source of hope that perhaps their bloodline was strong enough to overcome whatever weakness had afflicted previous generations. But by age 2, it became clear that Tobias's development was severely delayed. He never learned to speak beyond simple sounds, never mastered walking without assistance. The couple had 9 more children between 1933 and 1947. Of these 10 children, 3 died in infancy. 1 drowned in the creek at age 7, and 5 survived to adulthood with varying degrees of physical and intellectual disabilities. Only 1 child, a daughter named Ruth after Silas's great-grandmother, seemed relatively unaffected, though she too bore the distinctive facial structure of the Blackburn line. By the 1950s, the hollow housed 23 people across 3 generations, all descendants of the original Ezekiel and Martha. The Korean War came and went. Elvis Presley revolutionized music. Television brought the world into American living rooms. But in Blackburn Hollow, life remained virtually unchanged from the 19th century. Tobias, despite his severe intellectual disabilities, was married at age 22 to his cousin Sarah, who was 16. This union, arranged by Silas to keep the family united, produced 5 children, 4 of whom showed severe abnormalities from birth. 1 child, a boy named Jacob, was born with his internal organs partially exposed, a condition called gastroschisis that would have been treatable with modern medicine but was fatal within hours in the isolated hollow. The family buried Jacob in the small cemetery they maintained on a hillside above the homestead. Wooden crosses marked at least 30 graves, though many were unlabeled, the names of the dead forgotten as the family's literacy declined with each generation. Dr. Morrison, examining medical literature during the 1978 investigation, found that the Blackburn family's experience matched patterns documented in other isolated, highly inbred populations around the world. The Samaritan community in Israel and Palestine, the Vodoma tribe in Zimbabwe, certain royal families of Europe all showed similar patterns when consanguinity persisted across generations. The genetic mechanism is brutally simple. Everyone carries recessive genes for various disorders. In a normal outbred population, the chances of 2 people carrying the same harmful recessive gene and both passing it to their child is very low. But when close relatives reproduce, the probability skyrockets. With each generation of inbreeding, harmful recessive genes accumulate and express themselves more frequently. The Blackburn family tree had become a genetic minefield. By 1978, calculating the exact coefficient of inbreeding was nearly impossible without modern genetic testing, but Dr. Morrison estimated it exceeded 25%, a level comparable to offspring of a father-daughter or brother-sister pairing, maintained across multiple generations. Historical records revealed another disturbing pattern. The family had occasionally attempted to integrate with the outside world. In 1952, Silas had taken 2 of his healthier sons to a coal mine operation 10 miles away, hoping they could earn wages. The mine foreman, immediately recognizing the distinctive Blackburn features and their limited intellectual capacity, turned them away. Reportedly telling Silas to keep your family up in those hills where they belong. This rejection reinforced the family's isolation and their conviction that the outside world would never accept them. They retreated further into their hollow, into their tightly woven bloodline, believing they had no other choice. By the mid-1970s, a 4th generation of inbred children was being born in Blackburn Hollow. These were the children Margaret Hayes encountered in 1978, the most genetically damaged generation yet, bearing the accumulated weight of nearly a century of consanguinity. Through the hollow at night, the mountain wind whispered, carrying with it the sounds of children who could not speak, who rocked and moaned in their suffering, trapped in bodies and minds warped by the sins of their fathers, grandfathers, and great-grandfathers. The Blackburn family's genetic nightmare had reached its devastating crescendo, but the full horror of their situation was still coming into focus. The investigation into the Blackburn family intensified throughout the autumn of 1978. Margaret Hayes, working with a team that now included state authorities, genealogists, and medical professionals, began the painstaking process of documenting the family's structure. What emerged was a family tree that looked less like a tree and more like a tangled web, where branches looped back and reconnected with themselves in ways that defied normal understanding. The main homestead, where Margaret first encountered the family, housed 16 people. But as investigators ventured deeper into the hollow and surrounding hills, they discovered 3 other dwellings, each occupied by Blackburn family members. In total, 31 people lived in this isolated community. And with the exception of one woman who had married into the family in 1965, every single person was a blood relative of Silas and Viola Blackburn. A geneticist from the University of Kentucky, Dr. Eleanor Hutchkins, who volunteered her expertise, spent weeks interviewing family members and constructing their genealogy. The work was frustrating. Many family members couldn't or wouldn't provide accurate information. Some genuinely didn't know their exact relationships, as concepts like cousin and sibling had become blurred over generations. Others were defensive, sensing that these questions were laying bare something shameful. "How is Ruth related to you?" Dr. Hutchkins asked Viola during one interview session, referring to one of the teenage girls in the hollow. Viola thought for a long moment, her weathered fingers picking at the hem of her dress. "Ruth's my granddaughter," she said finally, "but also my great-niece. Her daddy is my son, Tobias, and her mama is, well, her mama is Sarah, who's my brother's daughter." Dr. Hutchkins pressed. "And Sarah's relationship to Tobias?" "First cousins," Viola replied. Then after a pause, "Through his daddy's side, but second cousins through mine, I reckon." This conversation was typical of dozens Dr. Hutchkins conducted. The family relationships had become so convoluted that multiple paths of kinship existed between any 2 individuals. Ruth, the girl in question, was simultaneously the daughter, granddaughter, great-granddaughter, niece, grandniece, and second cousin of various family members. The physical toll of this genetic catastrophe was documented in meticulous detail. Of the 31 family members, only 7 showed no obvious physical abnormalities. 24 suffered from conditions ranging from mild to severe, including 6 individuals with profound intellectual disabilities who required full-time care and could not speak, feed themselves, or control basic bodily functions. 8 individuals with moderate intellectual disabilities who had limited speech, could perform simple tasks, but would never be able to live independently. 12 individuals with physical deformities including cleft palates, fused digits, skeletal malformations, and facial dysmorphisms. 3 individuals who were deaf. 5 individuals with seizure disorders. 2 individuals with both physical and severe intellectual disabilities. Many family members had multiple conditions simultaneously. A 12-year-old boy named Ezekiel, named after the family's founding patriarch, was blind in one eye, had a cleft palate so severe he could barely eat solid food, was deaf in both ears, and functioned intellectually at approximately a 2-year-old level. He spent his days sitting in the dirt, drawing patterns with a stick, wearing only a ragged shirt despite the October chill in the mountain air. For the investigation team, the emotional weight of witnessing this suffering was overwhelming. In her official report, Margaret Hayes wrote, "These are not animals, though they've been forced to live little better than animals. These are human beings, children of God, who've been condemned by the choices of their ancestors and the failure of society to intervene. Every one of these children deserves better than this living nightmare." The family's response to the investigation was mixed. The younger members, especially those with normal or near-normal intelligence, seemed curious about the outside world and the possibility of a different life. But the older generation, particularly Silas and Viola, viewed the investigators as invaders threatening to destroy their family. "We ain't hurting nobody," Silas told Margaret during a tense confrontation in early November 1978. "We stay up here, mind our business. What we do is our affair." "Mr. Blackburn," Margaret replied, choosing her words carefully, "these children are suffering. They need medical care, education. They deserve a chance at a better life." "Better life?" Silas's voice rose, his face reddening. "You going to take them away from their family? Put them in homes where they'll be gawked at like circus freaks? We take care of our own. Always have." This defensive attitude was rooted in more than simple stubbornness. The Blackburn family had internalized generations of rejection and shame. They had constructed an entire worldview around their isolation, convincing themselves that their way of life was not only acceptable but necessary for their survival as a family unit. Viola expressed this in heartbreaking terms during one interview. "We know what we look like. We know people think we're cursed, but these children are loved. Every one of them. You think the world down there will love them? They'll be locked up, studied, maybe even cut open to see what's wrong inside them. Here, they're with their own kind. They're home." Dr. Hutchkins tried to explain the genetic reality to the family's more capable members. She brought diagrams, simple explanations of how harmful genes accumulate when close relatives have children together. Some listened with interest, others refused to engage. Thomas Blackburn, Silas's 40-year-old son, who had normal intelligence despite his distinctive facial features, asked questions that showed he understood more than his father gave him credit for. "So, you're saying our blood is poison? That we're making monsters?" "No," Dr. Hutchkins replied gently. "I'm saying that when families are isolated and members only reproduce with close relatives across many generations, harmful genes become concentrated. This isn't anyone's fault, but it is a reality we can't ignore. Your children, all these children, deserve a chance to grow up healthy." Thomas was silent for a long time, staring at his hands, one of which had 2 fingers fused together from birth. "It's all we've ever known," he said finally. "At this moment, I want you to think about something. Think about these children born into circumstances beyond their control, trapped by decisions made generations before they existed. If this story moves you, leave a comment saying, 'Every child deserves a chance.' Let me know you're hearing their story." The investigation also uncovered the family's economic reality. They survived on approximately $200 per year in cash income earned by selling ginseng root and occasional pelts from trapped animals. They had no electricity, no running water, no telephone. Their diet consisted primarily of beans, cornmeal, wild game, and whatever vegetables they could grow in the rocky soil. Medical care was virtually non-existent. The last time any family member had seen a doctor was 1961 when a traveling physician treated a child for a broken arm. Childbirth occurred in the homestead, assisted by elder family women with no formal training. Infant mortality was staggering. Dr. Hutchkins estimated that fewer than half of all children born in the Hollow since 1940 survived to age 5. The cemetery on the hillside told its own story. Margaret, with a state archaeologist, counted 47 graves, 32 of which were small enough to be children. Many graves were unmarked or marked only with river stones. The oldest legible marker dated to 1891, a wooden cross bearing the name Martha E. Blackburn, beloved mother. As autumn deepened into winter, the investigation team faced a crucial question: what could be done? The children needed medical care, education, and intervention, but removing them from their family would be traumatic and legally complex. The adults, while perhaps negligent by modern standards, were not overtly abusive within the context of their cultural isolation. Kentucky Social Services had never dealt with a case of this magnitude. The Blackburn family represented a collision between individual rights, cultural autonomy, medical necessity, and child welfare that had no clear solution. Meanwhile, in Blackburn Hollow, life continued much as it had for nearly a century. Children who would never speak played in the dirt. Adults with the minds of children performed simple chores, and the family's genetic burden continued to manifest in new births, new deformities, new suffering. The sins of the father had become the inheritance of the children. And breaking that cycle would require confronting uncomfortable truths about what happens when isolation, poverty, and consanguinity intersect across generations. December 1978 brought the first major snowfall to Pike County. And with it, a crisis that would finally force action on the Blackburn family situation. On December 12, a 7-year-old girl named Annie Blackburn developed a high fever and severe respiratory distress. Her mother, a 23-year-old woman named Grace, who was herself intellectually disabled, tried to treat the child with home remedies, herb teas and cold compresses, but Annie's condition deteriorated rapidly. By the time word reached authorities 3 days later, Annie was barely conscious, her small body racked with pneumonia and severe dehydration. A rescue team, including Margaret Hayes and 2 paramedics, fought through 2 feet of snow to reach the hollow. What they found was a child on the verge of death, lying on a bare mattress in a room where gaps in the walls allowed snow to blow inside. Annie was airlifted to a hospital in Pikeville where doctors worked frantically to save her life. She survived, but just barely. Medical examination revealed that in addition to the pneumonia, Annie suffered from severe malnutrition, untreated parasitic infections, and what appeared to be tuberculosis. She weighed only 38 pounds, roughly half what a healthy 7-year-old should weigh. Dr. Robert Chun, the emergency room physician who treated Annie, was shaken by her condition. "This child has been living in third-world conditions," he told investigators. "The level of neglect is staggering. If she had gone another day without treatment, she would have died." Annie's near-death became the catalyst for immediate intervention. On December 18, 1978, a Pike County judge signed an emergency order granting temporary custody of all minors in Blackburn Hollow to the state. It was an unprecedented action, but the judge, Harold Pennington, felt he had no choice. "I've reviewed the medical reports, the living conditions, and the genealogical documentation," Judge Pennington stated in his order. "These children are living in conditions of profound neglect and are suffering from the ongoing consequences of multigenerational consanguineous relationships. The state has a compelling interest and moral obligation to intervene." The removal of the children occurred on January 5, 1979, one of the coldest days of that winter. A convoy of state vehicles accompanied by social workers and state police made the difficult journey into Blackburn Hollow. Margaret Hayes led the operation, her heart heavy with the knowledge of the trauma this would inflict on all involved. The scene that unfolded was heartbreaking. Viola Blackburn stood in front of her home, arms spread wide, screaming, "You can't take them. They're ours." Silas, weakened by age and illness, sat on the porch steps and wept, his weathered face buried in his hands. Several of the adult family members with intellectual disabilities didn't understand what was happening and became agitated and frightened. Thomas Blackburn, one of the more capable adults, tried to maintain calm, but his anguish was evident. "Please," he begged Margaret, "don't separate them. They're scared of the outside world. This is all they know." 17 children, ranging in age from 18 months to 17 years, were removed from the hollow that day. The operation took 6 hours and required multiple trips. Many of the children had never been in a vehicle before and were terrified. Several had seizures triggered by the stress. One teenage boy, unable to comprehend what was happening, tried to run back to the hollow and had to be gently restrained. The children were taken to a facility in Pikeville, where medical and psychological evaluations could be conducted. The medical findings were devastating and comprehensive. All 17 children showed signs of malnutrition and parasitic infections. 14 had dental decay so severe that many teeth required extraction. 9 required immediate surgery for various conditions including hernias, correctable skeletal deformities, and one child's improperly healed broken arm. 6 had never received any vaccinations and contracted measles within weeks of removal, requiring quarantine. 12 scored below the first percentile on standardized developmental assessments appropriate for their ages. The psychological evaluations revealed that many children, despite their severe disabilities, were deeply bonded to their family and traumatized by separation. This presented care providers with a profound ethical dilemma. These children had been suffering in the hollow, but removing them was also causing suffering. Dr. Patricia Walsh, a psychologist assigned to the case, noted, "These children's attachment to their family is genuine and deep, regardless of the conditions they lived in. We're providing them with better physical care, but we're also inflicting emotional trauma by separating them from the only caregivers they've ever known. There are no clean solutions here." The adults remaining in Blackburn Hollow fell into profound grief. Viola stopped eating and had to be hospitalized for malnutrition within a month of the children's removal. Silas developed pneumonia and died on February 3, 1979, at age 68. Family members claimed he died of a broken heart. And in a sense, they were right. The stress and trauma of losing the children had weakened his already fragile health. The case attracted regional media attention, though out of concern for the children's privacy, most outlets reported it only in general terms. Eastern Kentucky families' children removed due to inbreeding and neglect. Still, word spread through the mountains and the Blackburn name became synonymous with the darkest consequences of isolation and consanguinity. State officials faced the daunting challenge of finding appropriate placements for children with such profound needs. Most foster families were unprepared for the level of care required. Group homes specializing in intellectual disabilities had waiting lists, and the children's unique combination of physical and cognitive challenges made them extraordinarily difficult to place. A few of the less severely affected children were eventually placed with foster families. Ruth, the 17-year-old who had near-normal intelligence despite her distinctive facial features, was placed with a family in Lexington. She struggled enormously with culture shock. Indoor plumbing, electricity, television, and grocery stores were all foreign concepts. She attended school for the first time in her life and was placed in special education classes where she worked with teachers trying to overcome 17 years of no formal education. Ruth's journal entries from this period, preserved in court records, are heartbreaking. "Everything is too loud here, too bright. I miss the quiet of the hollow. I miss my brothers and sisters, even the ones who can't talk. Here, people stare at me. They whisper. I know I look different. I know where I come from. I want to go home, but they say home isn't safe. If home isn't safe, why does being here hurt so much?" The most severely disabled children remained in institutional care. Technology in 1979 was limited, but caregivers did their best to provide comfort, medical treatment, and basic enrichment. Still, many of these children never adjusted. They had lived their entire lives in the close, if dysfunctional, embrace of their family. Now, they were in sterile facilities surrounded by strangers. 4 of the children died within 3 years of removal. Not from abuse or neglect in their new placements, but from the accumulated effects of years of untreated conditions, malnutrition, and genetic disorders. Each death was investigated thoroughly, and each time medical examiners concluded that the state intervention had come too late to reverse damage done over a lifetime. These deaths devastated Margaret Hayes. "We saved them from one kind of death," she told a colleague, "but we couldn't save them from the consequences of being born into that family. Every single one of those children was doomed before they took their first breath, condemned by choices made by their great-great-grandparents." Back in Blackburn Hollow, The remaining adults tried to rebuild their shattered lives. With Silas dead and most of the younger generation removed, only 12 adults remained, all bearing the physical and mental scars of generations of inbreeding. Thomas Blackburn, at 40, became the de facto leader of what remained of the family. The state continued monitoring the adults, and social workers made monthly visits to ensure basic living standards were maintained. A small trust was established to provide modest financial support enough to ensure they had food and basic necessities. But the hollow felt empty, haunted by the absence of children's voices, however limited those voices had been. Legal proceedings continued throughout 1979 and into 1980. Several family members challenged the state's custody decision, arguing that the removal was overly broad and traumatic. The case eventually reached the Kentucky Supreme Court, which upheld the lower court's decision in a ruling that acknowledged the extraordinary circumstances. While we recognize the fundamental right of families to privacy and autonomy, that right cannot supersede the state's obligation to protect children from demonstrable harm. The conditions documented in this case, extreme neglect, untreated medical conditions, and the ongoing practice of consanguineous relationships producing genetically damaged children, constitute circumstances where state intervention is not only justified but morally required. The ruling set precedent for future cases involving isolated communities and consanguinity, though such cases remained thankfully rare. By late 1980, the immediate crisis had passed. But the Blackburn family story was far from over. The children removed from the hollow would carry the consequences of their genetics for the rest of their lives. The adults remaining in the mountains would live with grief and loss. And the broader questions raised by the case about poverty, isolation, genetic health, and the limits of family autonomy would continue to challenge policymakers and ethicists for decades to come. The hollow itself seemed to mourn, the wind through the bare winter trees sounding almost like voices crying out in the darkness. By 1985, the Blackburn family case had largely faded from public consciousness. But for those directly involved, the consequences continued to unfold like a slow-motion tragedy. The children removed from the hollow had scattered across Kentucky and neighboring states, placed in various facilities and foster homes, each carrying the indelible mark of their genetic heritage. Ruth Blackburn, who had shown such promise when first removed at age 17, struggled profoundly with integration into mainstream society. Despite years of special education and social support, she never overcame the deep-seated feeling of being an outsider. At age 23 in 1984, she attempted to return to Blackburn Hollow, walking the 30 miles from her group home in Pikeville back to the mountains that had shaped her. Thomas Blackburn, who still lived in the hollow with a handful of adult relatives, described Ruth's return. She came walking up through the trees one morning, skinny as a rail, her shoes all torn up. She didn't say nothing at first, just stood there crying. Then she said, "I don't belong out there. I don't belong anywhere." Ruth remained in the hollow for 3 months before social workers convinced her to return to supervised care. The experience highlighted a cruel reality. While the state had removed the children from conditions of neglect and genetic catastrophe, it could not provide them with a sense of belonging or peace. They were caught between two worlds, fully accepted by neither. The most severely disabled children never left institutional care. Ezekiel, the boy who had been blind in one eye and deaf, died in 1982 at age 16 from complications of a seizure disorder. Annie, whose near death from pneumonia had triggered the state intervention, lived until 1987 when she succumbed to respiratory failure at age 15. Her small body, ravaged by genetic conditions and years of early neglect, simply gave out. Each death was documented, each funeral attended by Margaret Hayes, who maintained contact with the children she had helped remove. "I did what I thought was right," she told a reporter in a rare 1985 interview. But right doesn't mean without cost. These children paid the price for their families' isolation and choices made generations before they were born. We gave them medical care and safety, but we couldn't give them normal lives. That ship had sailed long before I ever set foot in that hollow. The medical community